Because what really motivates us within the Social Work Action Network is that there is a drive from government and within local authorities to promote a particular type of social work. It's not a kind of social work that we think is very profitable for those who have to work extra long hours in terrible conditions. We don't think it's a social work that is particularly useful to service users who find building relationships with social workers increasingly difficult. But our view is that that doesn't mean that there is nothing of value within social work. It means that there is an alternative social work. Another social work is possible, and it's up to people like us to hold on to that vision of what that other social work is about and to take that into our courses, our universities and our workplaces in statutory and voluntary sector organisations, and to put down a marker for a better social work as part of a movement for a better world. So that's what SWAN is really about. And because that's what SWAN is about, we always try to start, the keynote address is always given by someone who is not a social worker. Because we don't want to be narrow, we want to engage with the wide social science debates that are taking place about the shape of modern Britain or the shape of the modern world. And when we were putting this year's conference together, we were thinking about who we wanted to come along, and we thought, do you think Danny Dorling would come? And we thought, well, we're not quite sure, but we'll certainly try and we'll certainly hope. And I wrote Danny an email, and almost immediately he came back saying that it would be delighted for him, he would be delighted to come along and to speak to us. So it is a real great privilege for the Social Work Action Network to have Danny Dorling with us this afternoon. Danny will be talking for 30 minutes. At the end of his talk, there will be about 20 minutes for contributions and questions, and then we'll bring Danny back for a sum-up before we move on to the rest of the conference. So without further ado, Danny Dorling.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much for the email. I think it shows more that I like the sound of my own voice. As I said yes straight away, so I'll try and keep my own voice definitely to less than 30 minutes, because what matters much more is what you say. A lot of what I'm going to say is generally known, it just needs to be collected together. Before I begin, what I want to say about all of this is that there is a great danger that you can become very depressed when you start to talk about what is happening with inequality and in the poorest parts of Britain. And the danger of that is that you then become inactive, you go into despair, you think there's nothing that can be done about it. So I'm deliberately not going to do that. I'm deliberately not going to keep on saying how terrible so much that is happening is, and I'm going to look for what's good in what's happening, and that becomes difficult at some times. Growing inequality in modern Britain. In terms of income and wealth, the amount of money that people get every week and the amount of money they hold, I suspect that inequality has never been growing faster. The reason I say I suspect is that we know it's been growing faster than at any time since around 1918. We don't have records from before 1918. But currently, the average standard of living dropping, standard of living at the bottom dropping much faster than the average, and the well-off getting better off and the very well-off getting much, much better off. That is a pretty unprecedented situation to occur. That is not normal. We've had inequalities rising for the last 30-odd years, but we haven't had this acceleration, and we haven't had, to use an old phrase, absolute immiseration at the bottom for most of my working life. This sneaky little map, I don't think I've got many more maps, but I wanted to put this one in because we're in Liverpool. And if you can cast your mind back to the start of this year, you may remember there was a release of cabinet papers from 30 years ago, and one minister, he was a particularly forgettable minister, I've forgotten his name and I'm quite happy about that, but one minister was reported as having advocated managed decline for Liverpool. He said he couldn't remember having done it, but it was minuted. What this map is showing, it's a strange map because it makes areas large where there's lots of people, so you don't have to look at sheep as you normally do. The green area is where the population has increased near to that area, which is London and the South East. The purple areas have actually had population decrease. It's moved a bit to make the pattern simpler. But you see the northwest decreasing, the northeast decreasing, and Glasgow decreasing in population. This was the change in the 1990s. We don't yet know the change for the last decade because until we take a census, we have no idea how many people are in this country. We took a census, but the results haven't come out yet. But I wanted to put the map up to show you that when, in 1981, 1982, they talked secretly in Cabinet about managed decline, they meant it. That's what you actually got. And I think it's important to think now that there will be discussions in private just as malevolent, if you like, as those discussions were then. You simply cannot trust people in power to be telling you the truth about what they think, what their plan is, and what they feel. I'm going to pick on Sheffield for the next few slides, but you could take almost any city outside London and do this. This map of Sheffield, you can get it on the web. It's at the CASA, C-A-S-A website, and you can get it from anywhere in the country. So you can zoom in on your street and see whether you're labelled as deprived, as average, or as posh. It's the government's official deprivation index. The dark red areas are the lowest area, and the dark green are the least deprived areas. And almost everywhere looks as stark as this when you look at it. The trick on the map, by the way, is to not colour the fields in, and then suddenly the pattern becomes much more obvious. Now, I'm going to show you a series of graphs and some numbers, but essentially when I'm talking about the poorer part of Sheffield, it's over here, and the richer part of Sheffield is over here. But we could be doing this for any city. Over inequalities, just to kind of give you a basic summary of an argument, not everything has been getting worse in the last 30 years. In the last 10 years, two particular inequalities got better. The inequality in terms of worklessness between places without jobs and places with jobs fell. Most of the jobs, the extra jobs we got, went to the places without jobs. Partly because the places with jobs already had them, so they couldn't go up anyway. But that inequality did get better until about a year and a half ago. And the second inequality that got better, although we only noticed it about 2 years ago, was that education spending on children and the result of spending more education, more resources on those children who needed it more, did become a little bit more equal, such that children did better at school and stayed on at school more, and they got EMAs which helped them stay on at school, so that by the end of the New Labour period, by 2010, for the first time ever, you had a bigger increase in working class children going to university than poorer children. Those were the two inequalities that fell in the last few decades. The ones that kept on rising were inequalities in wealth, which are now getting much, much bigger, inequalities in income, which rose under the last government, and inequalities in health, which rose dramatically under the last government. Now, as far as I can tell, all five of those inequalities are rising. The only question mark is over health, and there is a chance that some of the work done by the last government will have resulted with a lag in a slight reduction in inequalities in health. You've got a sense of the kind of nitty-picky kind of stuff that I do and how tedious it can get, so I'll try and get out of that and just show you some simpler things. To be optimistic, one really important thing is to remember that everything wasn't brilliant in 2005. People forget that the world wasn't necessarily wonderful in 2005, before the beginnings of anything that would lead up to the current crash. This is a map from around about the year 2000 of the average number of teeth in 5-year-olds that were decayed or missing. And this is a map by the year 2004 of the average number of teeth missing or decayed. So you're getting up to 3 teeth in an average 5-year-old in parts of Sheffield. And it's a simple way of measuring things getting worse in an absolute way you wouldn't want them to get worse in. Another thing worth saying, although I don't have the graph for it here, about 2005, is that in 2005, public spending, so that's spending on students here, on the salaries of social workers here, on the academics here, public spending in Britain as a proportion of GDP was lower than every other country in Western Europe apart from Spain and Italy. The last government was a low public spending government. It was higher than the USA, which is very low spending, but only Spain and Italy had a lower percent of their GDP on public spending. Now, with the cuts that are forecast to come, public spending as a proportion of GDP in Britain is going to fall below every other European nation, even Greece, by 2015, and for the first time ever, below public spending in the United States of America. And this is part of what's unprecedented. And the danger is if you lay these things on and on again, you can begin to despair. Because Britain becomes a poster boy, if you like, for people in America who are on the right, who want to say what they would like. Just trying to bring it home, some very simple things. That's the number of children aged under 11 who were hit by cars, mostly seriously injured rather than killed in those constituencies of Sheffield. The constituencies contain the same number of children. So you can see an almost sevenfold difference between areas. You get repeated examples like this. If you're advocating doing anything in a city, anything cheap, the cheapest, fastest thing you can do to reduce inequalities in city for children is to bring 20-mile-an-hour signs in. I know I'm talking at a social work conference, and I know social workers protect children, but the biggest danger to children is not other adults or other children, it is the cars we drive around. And if you're talking about wider advocacy and thinking more generally, and people say, what on earth can we do? We have no money, we can't do very much. I would argue there actually is quite a lot of money, but even if you don't want to spend very much money, if you want to have an immediate improvement on people's lives, on pensioners' lives, on children's lives, on families' lives, on everybody's life apart from a few very selfish car drivers, reducing to 20 mile an hour has an effect. In Sheffield, we have a 16-year life expectancy difference between the worst off and best off areas. This is not unusual. This is a normal British city life expectancy difference. 16 years less for everybody in the red area there, which is only 10 metres from my office, literally just over the road from the university in Sheffield, compared to the yellow areas where people are living longer on average for everybody. One thing that many people are not aware of when they hear that number and they see those stats is that this gap is not about the good behaviour of the yellow areas and the terrible bad behaviour of people in the red areas who are smoking or taking drugs or all the rest of it. It's all about migration. It's all about movement. The only way you can get an area with such a low life expectancy in Sheffield is if people are moving into that area who've got poor life chances continuously. There are some very direct ways they move into that area. They get enough housing points because of their medical conditions to get housed in that area. But you also have to have people leaving that area if they possibly can. That's what keeps an area down. And what keeps an area up, having a high life expectancy, is a continuous arrival of people whose health is good. And the leaving from that area, from the yellow areas, of people for whom anything goes wrong in their life. They lose their job, they split up with their partner, or they become ill. And this happens nationally. It's migration, it's the movement of people that causes these gaps to be growing. It's not their behaviours. You've got to ask, what is causing the increasing migration? Why are people sorting themselves out more and more in different parts of our cities? It's not long established. Although Sheffield was a bit late coming to it, these areas encompass the entire city, and again, we could do this for Liverpool, we could do it for Manchester. It'll be harder to do for London. You've only got to go back to 1994 to find a time when there wasn't that much of a difference between the cost of housing in the neighbourhoods of this city. And then something happened, and the same thing has happened everywhere, often a bit earlier, of two areas next to each other. They happen to be the two halves of Nick Clegg's constituency. Two areas next to each other just take off in house prices. And think about how that affects the distribution of wealth in Sheffield. Where all the money's going, where the future inheritance will be, whose children are going to get that. And it becomes self-reinforcing. As house prices go up in one part of the city, people who can try to get into that part of the city. They try and get away from the schools where the house prices aren't going up. And it accelerates. And that's the cycle we're in at the moment. It's accelerated so much in Sheffield that the secondary school that was on the border had to be closed because people wouldn't go to it anymore. So you end up with this kind of gap in your city. Some things did get better. These are unemployment rates for the 6 constituencies in Sheffield, and again, we could show them for other places. Now, Hallam, the purple one at the bottom, you never get up to above 6% unemployment in the best of area. So when unemployment goes up, and we expect it to carry on going up, we may be in the second part of a double-dip recession right now. Unemployment goes up in the poor parts of the city and hardly goes up at all in the richer parts of the city. Partly because people have to leave the richer parts of the city if they become unemployed. The reason for putting that up is just to show you a set of lines all coming together in the 1990s and 2000s. It's not necessarily good work. People were being forced into work. It was often minimum wage work and often very, very tedious work. But it did happen, and it's now going in the opposite direction. The budget seems a long time ago now, the budget. There aren't many millionaires in Sheffield, but what the budget did, amongst much else, is give every person who is receiving £1 million a year £40,000 extra. Well, if you had 3 dozen millionaires, we probably do have 3 dozen millionaires in Sheffield, that's giving them 1.5 million extra every year by dropping the 50p rate to 45. If you had one person earning 36 million, they'd be getting that 1.5 million extra. And the argument for giving that money to these very rich people was that they would spend it wisely. They would create wealth. And I know it's funny, but I think one thing and actually it does help to laugh, I think, because one of the most powerful forms to cope with inequality rising is to use humour and to take the piss out of people at the top. One of the saddest things in Britain at the moment is that there are quite a lot of people who believe that. They actually believe that these people who've got lots of money will create more money out of nowhere. They're magical wealth creators. And the less you tax them, the more it will get. And part of the reason they believe that is simple innumeracy. Since the 1970s, the amount of tax paid by the top 1% has gone up and up and up. The top 1% now pay over 25% of all income tax. I think it's around 27%, just 1% paying 27%. So you can suddenly see how George Osborne and Dave Cameron think the top 1% are paying more tax, a bigger share of tax, than they have done for decades and decades and decades. So it must be because we've reduced the tax rate that they're paying more tax. I could be mean. I think it shows why an eating education isn't good. The reason why the top 1% are paying a quarter of all tax is because the top 1% are now paying themselves 20% of all the national income. When the top 1%, when I was a boy, only got 6 times the national income, or 4 times after tax, they didn't contribute much in tax because they didn't have to. because everybody who was working contributed in taxes and was paid enough that their contributions were enough. As the rich take more money and pay themselves more, the amount that they pay in tax in total, but not as a proportion of their income, rises. And at that point, you've lost George Osborne and Danny Alexander. Or, and I don't believe this, but I'm sure because you're going to get a long chance to talk, you can tell me that they really do know this, and I won't use the word because I'm being good. 1.5 million, that's the money being given to the very rich in a city like Sheffield. From next week, any of you who are currently working less than 24 hours a week, but over 16 hours a week and have got kids and are claiming child tax credits, know that you'll be losing that unless you can find yourselves the extra hours to get it up to 24 a week. There are loads of people doing brilliant work around the country, giving questions to MPs to answer in PQs, collecting the answers of parliamentary questions back and collating and so on. These numbers come from somebody I've never met called Howard Knight in Sheffield, who just keeps on sending me these emails occasionally. And they're from parliamentary questions. But they're showing the number of households in Sheffield and the number of children in those households that can expect, if people cannot find those extra hours of work, to see their annual income cut by up to £728 a year. And just to give you an idea, this is David Blunkett's constituency. 1,750 children will be in households which from next week will be seeing that income drop. And these are already poor households. I mean, that's why they're getting the child tax credits. In the entire household, there isn't somebody working in collection more than 24 hours a week. And in Hallam, on the other side of the city, the numbers are too few to report. Here are all the areas of England where the numbers that are going to be affected by this change are too few to report. These are the places where you can't get to meet people who are suffering from government policy. And this is one important change in Britain. As I was telling you about people moving around in areas of the city and the posh areas getting posher and the poor getting poorer, people are getting to know less and less about each other's lives, and the same is happening nationally. So there are parts of the country where you can never meet people who are relying on benefits, never meet people who get chucked out of school before the age of 16. There are large parts of the country where it is normal to have 2 cars. You are strange if your household has 1 car. And this partly explains a lot of the attitudes that we have and shows how hard I think it gets to change attitudes. Because when people see a list, these are the areas with the most children who are about to lose out from next week and the week after and the week after, all the time till they get up to being adults. The differences is so great between those thousands of children in those constituencies and the too small to be reported in the others, that you have a problem of translation. And one asset, I won't try and stick my foot in it too much, but there are groups of people who tend to move more between Britain's communities than others. Often those groups can be not helpful. The least helpful group I know are MPs, who begin to resent their constituents when they have to go to surgery every Friday with them. GPs are often not brilliant either. But I would hope social workers could be somewhat better than these groups. But as this divide between different parts of Britain grows, the number of people who are crossing the divide reduces. Where's all the money? If you're looking for sources of money or ways out of this problem, my favourite is land tax, and that just gives you an idea of how much the little shopping centre near me is worth. It's actually built on the design of a prison. If you've ever been to Meadowhall and wondered why the corridors are like they are and all the shops come off like they are, it was built that way in case it didn't work, and then they could put iron grills on and turn it into another prison in the archipelago. So that's what's going to happen if the crash gets worse. But I won't go on about where the money is. There is a lot of money. A huge amount of it is held in the value of land. It cannot be taken offshore. If there were a need, it's possible to find it. Trying to begin to wrap up now on things that are more positive. This is a little graph which looks at the 25 richest countries in the world. They're sorted here by which are most unequal. This is the United States, this is Singapore, this is Japan. In the United States, the best off 10% of people get over 16 times more than the worst off people. In Japan, it's only 4 times more. Has huge effects on all kinds of things in society. If you ever read the Spirit Level book by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, you'll know about these. This is a very rough relationship. It's not that neat. These tend to be more island communities. But in general, this is how much rubbish people throw away. I was like, rubbish is the way we measure consumption. Almost everything you buy, apart from jewellery, you're going to throw away in a short amount of time. Otherwise your house would fill up. So we can measure how much people buy by how much they throw away. And consumption is much higher in more unequal countries. People feel the need to spend more. So the reason this is an optimistic graph is it's suggesting that if you could reduce inequality in income and in wealth, you would actually find that you were needing less stuff overall because people weren't having to keep up with the Joneses. And keeping up with the Joneses often means desperately trying to get into the school catchment area of a school where everybody doesn't appear to fail, and what you spend trying to do that kind of thing. I'm going to go back and leave this graph on while people are talking, because I think this graph is really important for reasons to be optimistic. This graph comes from the new collection of data being held in Paris on the world top incomes. What the best off 1% and 0.1% of people in each country have been earning in the last year. I think tea signs arrived. And it takes this data back as far as it can in many cases. Now, often you are told that what we're currently going through is inevitable. It's a result of globalization. It's stupid to think you can reduce inequalities. That in all countries, inequalities have been rising. All we can do is try to be nice to the poor, but let our wealth creators carry on trying to create wealth, and that's the only hope we possibly have. What this graph shows is for 2 countries that are not particularly radical in any way. This isn't Japan, which is an extreme country in one way, or it's not Sweden or Norway, but for 2 fairly average OECD countries, the Netherlands and Switzerland, around about 1920, they were like we were. In 1920, the best off 1% in Britain had around about 20% of all income, 20 times the average. In Britain and everywhere else it fell. What you're looking at here is the Netherlands, to a low point in the 1970s. And if you remember, I said about 6 times the average for the best off 1%. But then look what happened in the Netherlands since the 1970s, and look what's happened in Switzerland. This is where the data stops at the moment. The best off 1% in Switzerland and the Netherlands have never had less of a share of national income. Swiss bankers on average get half as much money as our bankers, and the banks in Switzerland still work. Everything still works in the Netherlands. The argument that you have to let the rich get richer doesn't hold. The UK figure and the USA figure is currently up here. That's a huge amount of money, spare money. If you were to take the top 10% of people in Britain and reduce their incomes down to just what their parents had relatively, so they're still better off than everybody else, but they're only 6 times better off rather than 12 times better off. The money you save by doing that, I've written it up for a paper that IPPR published 2 days ago, and it's on the web if you want to know. The money you save from a reduction of income inequalities to the levels we had when I was a child, even if you increase 90% of people's wages by 1%, the money you save isn't just enough to give everybody who hasn't got a job under 25 a job, full-time £7 an hour job. You can give 1 million young people a full-time £7 an hour job 15 times over. That's You can create 15 million jobs for the amount of money that people at the top have now taken compared to the 70s. So, this is the optimistic point I want to end on, or begin to end on. I will just do 1 minute to talk. Even a slight move in that direction, a slight reduction in incomes at the top, a slight take of wealth, changing the council tax system, so we go for little cat Z, if you know your Dr. Seuss. You don't stop council tax at band A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You carry on to M, N, O, P, Q. Whoever designed the council tax system obviously worked out that it could go up to Z. Just a few little things like that generate so much money, because there's now so much at the top, that they can have a massive effect to most people in most areas. People at the top find it very hard to cope with this, because they've tended to live all their lives under the assumption that there should be people at the top and they're special. And the more you get at the top, the more you have to tell yourself you're special just to keep going. There's a plug, but the cartoon is more interesting than the plug, although the book is out the back, I noticed. I just like the description of the champagne bottle and just trickling it down over those glasses and seeing that it simply couldn't pour down to fill them all. New Labour policy was trickle-down economics. It was, we'll let the city and the rich get richer and hope we can trickle down. And they did build schools and hospitals and so on. It lasted for a bit, but that's what it was. Now that's ended, it can't carry on again. I'm going to just take us back just to this particularly complicated graph for you to look at. Just remember, the Netherlands and Switzerland. Not a socialist utopia, not a revolution, not a kind of faraway dream. A very short flight across the North Sea, or if you're going to be better behaved, then a train journey under the Channel. And you can see what's possible. Britain is such a strange country, the fourth most unequal country of the 25 richest in the world, more unequal in income than Israel. We're such a strange country that we've even begun to believe that it isn't possible to do better. And I think that's partly a product of the inequality and just how bad things have got. Thank you very much for your attention.